From New York and Glasgow, this is Democracy Now!
My heart was broken by the people inside that COP building, by the world leaders who steal our sacred words and use them to defend and uphold the oppressive systems of capitalism and white supremacy, who tell us that action needed to prevent sea level rise engulfing my ancestral home in Jamaica is impossible or not practical.
Over 100,000 people filled the streets of Glasgow in a pair of major rallies to urge world leaders to take more action to address the climate emergency. We'll hear from British activist Michaela Loach, who's suing the UK government over its climate policies, Vanessa Nakate of Uganda, and Greta Thunberg of Sweden.
The COP has turned into a PR event where leaders are giving beautiful speeches and announcing fancy commitments and targets, while behind the curtains, the governments of the global north countries are still refusing to take any drastic climate action.
Plus, 1,000 land and environmental defenders have been killed since the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015. Some were remembered this weekend.
Maritza Isabel Quiroz was a land defender and peasant leader. She was assassinated in Santa Marta in 2019. Justice for Maritza.
Justice!
She was an environmental leader and women's organizer opposed to the Puerto of Truga, and she was assassinated in Nuki in 2020. Justice for Juana.
Justice!
We'll speak with Andrea Ishu, a Maya Quiche leader and journalist from Guatemala, and Louis Wilson of Global Witness, both inside the Glasgow COP. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the United Nations Climate Summit continues in Glasgow, Scotland, more than 100,000 demonstrators took to the streets over the weekend to demand more urgent and meaningful action to prevent a planetary catastrophe. Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg called COP26 a failure. This is Ugandan climate activist Vanessa Nakate addressing the crowd Saturday.
And leaders continue to open up new coal power plants, construct oil pipelines, and frack gas without paying attention and listening to the voices crying out for help because of the destruction that is happening. That leaders have failed to understand that we cannot eat coal, we cannot drink oil, and we cannot breathe so-called natural gas.
We'll hear more from Vanessa and many others after headlines. Marches and rallies took place on every continent Saturday, as well as online, as part of the global movement. Meanwhile, an analysis by Global Witness found hundreds of fossil fuel lobbyists are flooding COP26 with over 100 coal, oil, and gas companies and associated groups represented. If the fossil fuel lobby were a national delegation at COP, it would be by far the largest, according to the report, and we'll speak with one of those who did the report. The U.S. House passed the bipartisan $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill Friday after months of delays, which President Biden hailed as a monumental step. The measure includes $550 billion in new investments for bridges, roads, airports, waterways, public transit, and broadband infrastructure. Lawmakers, however, did not vote for the Democrats' more expansive climate and social safety package yet, after conservative Democrats insisted on waiting for a cost analysis from the Congressional Budget Office, which could take days or weeks. A group of 6 progressive House members voted against the bipartisan infrastructure bill, insisting its passage should have remained tied to the vote on President Biden's $1.75 trillion measure. The 6 are Congress members Jamal Bowman, Cory Bush, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, and Rashida Tlaib. Congressmember Omar said in a statement, quote, passing the infrastructure bill without passing the Build Back Better Act first risks leaving behind child care, paid leave, health care, climate action, housing, education, and a roadmap to citizenship, she said. Pramila Jayapal, chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, expressed confidence both bills will eventually pass.
We will have the votes to pass Build Back Better. And let me just say that when we do, it will be a phenomenal achievement for our country to say we're not leaving anybody behind. This rule vote tonight is the beginning of the delivering of that promise. It is actually codifying that promise that our colleagues have made to us tonight.
Meanwhile, as conservative lawmakers have worked to slash climate provisions in the Build Back Better Act, a new report finds at least 28 U.S. senators collectively hold up to $12.6 million in fossil fuel investments. A federal appeals court on Saturday temporarily blocked President Biden's COVID vaccine mandate for large businesses after a group of Republican attorneys general challenged the order. The mandate would require workers at companies with at least 100 workers to be vaccinated or get tested weekly. In Los Angeles, patients 12 and older must now provide proof of vaccination before entering indoor restaurants, bars, movies, theaters, malls, gyms, salons, and other venues. The U.S. is lifting entry restrictions today for fully vaccinated international travelers from a host of countries that had been barred because of the pandemic, including Brazil, China, India, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and much of the European Union. Exceptions will be made for children and people arriving from certain countries where vaccines are not widely available. All travelers will also have to provide a negative COVID test. In medical news, Pfizer said Friday its experimental antiviral COVID pill cut rates of hospitalization and death by nearly 90% in high-risk adults and will ask the FDA and other regulators for approval. Last week, the UK became the first country to approve Merck's oral antiviral drug. In India, a fire killed at least 11 patients from a COVID ward at a hospital in the state of Maharashtra. It's at least the third hospital fire in India in recent months that resulted in mass casualties. Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi survived an assassination attempt after unknown assailants tried to fly explosive-laden drones into his home in Baghdad's heavily fortified Green Zone overnight Saturday. Iraqi authorities said 2 of the drones were shot down, but at least one other managed to strike the prime minister's official residence, blowing in doors and windows. No one has claimed responsibility for the attack, which reportedly left 10 guards injured. The attack followed large protests against the results of last month's parliamentary elections, which saw candidates representing pro-Iran Shia militias lose ground. On Friday, Iraqi soldiers fired tear gas and live rounds at demonstrators, with reports of at least 2 people killed and dozens injured. In the occupied West Bank, Israeli soldiers shot and killed a 13-year-old Palestinian boy Friday during protests against the expansion of illegal Israeli settlements. Mohammed Dadas died at a hospital after being shot in the stomach. According to Defense for Children International, at least 12 Palestinian children have been killed by Israeli occupation forces in the occupied West Bank so far this year. In Nicaragua, President Daniel Ortega appears to have secured his victory in Sunday's election after unleashing a months-long crackdown on his opposition. An early count shows Ortega receiving about 3/4 of the vote, with around half the ballots still to be counted. He's seeking a 4th term as president. Dozens of opposition figures, including 7 presidential hopefuls, have been arrested since June. That prompted international outcry and sanctions from the U.S., European Union, and other nations. This is an exiled Nicaraguan in San Jose, Costa Rica, at a protest denouncing Sunday's election.
In Nicaragua, there are no elections. In Nicaragua, there is an electoral circus where Ortega chose those who will accompany him in this political circus. He let his political allies go free, collaborationist parties, as we call them. He imprisoned those candidates who formed a genuine opposition.
The U.S. State Department's told all American citizens in Ethiopia they should leave as soon as possible as the prospect of wide-scale conflict mounts. The embassies of the U.S. and other countries evacuated all non-essential personnel. This came days after Ethiopia's government declared a state of emergency after Tigrayan rebels, backed by Oromo fighters, marched toward Addis Ababa, seizing 2 strategic towns less than 250 miles from the Ethiopian capital. On Sunday, Ethiopian authorities organized pro-government rallies attended by tens of thousands who pledged to defend Addis Ababa from the rebels. In Sudan, soldiers fired tear gas and arrested scores of people over the weekend as protesters opposed to the October 25th coup began a two-day strike and campaign of civil disobedience demanding a peaceful transition to civilian rule. The protests came as mediators from the Arab League traveled to Khartoum on Saturday for talks with the military coup leaders. The government of Sierra Leone has declared a national disaster and 3 days of national mourning after a fuel tanker exploded Friday in the capital Freetown, killing at least 100 people and wounding at least another 100. The blast happened after a vehicle struck a tanker in a street with heavy traffic. The victims reportedly included people who went to collect fuel as it leaked out of the tanker immediately following the crash. In Poland, tens of thousands of people took to the streets Saturday to decry the death of a 30-year-old pregnant woman who died in September after she was refused treatment amidst Poland's near-total ban on abortions. Advocates say Izabela, known as Isa, is the first person to die as a result of the draconian anti-choice law, as doctors refused to abort a fetus that showed numerous defects and delayed offering care to Isa until a fetal heartbeat could no longer be detected. This is an activist speaking at a rally in Warszawa on Saturday.
I don't want to die, Isa said to a woman in the hospital room. Isa did not receive help because she was pregnant, because the heart of the fetus was still beating. Isa could have lived. There was enough to take care of her health, and her life. Isa died on September 22nd from sepsis. Isa was a mother, daughter, wife, sister, friend.
A warning to our audience, this story contains descriptions of deadly violence. In Georgia, the trial of 3 white men who chased down and shot dead Ahmaud Arbery last year kicked off with opening statements Friday. The jury was also shown police body cam footage of the 25-year-old black jogger after he'd been killed. Prosecutor Linda Dunikoski described how the 3 defendants, Gregory McMichael, a former police officer, Travis McMichael, his son, and William Bryan, chased Arbery for 5 minutes in their pickup trucks until he was, quote, trapped like a rat. This is the prosecutor delivering her opening statement.
All 3 of these defendants did everything they did based on assumptions. Not on facts, not on evidence, on assumptions. And they made decisions in their driveways based on those assumptions that took a young man's life.
And in Houston, Texas, at least 8 people were killed, including 2 high school students aged 14 and 16, at the Astroworld Festival Friday night, after an audience of some 50,000 people rushed toward the stage, crushing those at the front. Hundreds more were injured. The chaos unfolded during a performance by the rapper Travis Scott, the festival's headliner and one of its organizers. Scott finished his set and brought out rapper Drake to perform as audience members begged security guards to stop the performance but were ignored. CNN reports the show continued for about 40 minutes after initial reports of audience members being injured. A police investigation is ongoing. At least 2 lawsuits have been filed against Travis Scott, Drake, Live Nation Entertainment, and others involved in the festival. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United Nations Climate Summit has entered its 2nd week. On Friday and Saturday, over 100,000 demonstrators took part in a pair of major climate rallies in the streets of Glasgow, Scotland. The first protest was organized by Fridays for Future, an international movement of students which grew out of Greta Thunberg's climate strike outside the Swedish Parliament in 2018. We begin today's show with some highlights from Friday's rally. This is Ugandan climate justice activist Evelyn Acham.
We emit very little CO2. Very little CO2 emissions, but we are suffering some of the worst impacts. People are dying from floods, disasters like droughts that are drying up people's crops, people's food. Uganda heavily depends on agriculture for food and water. But again, agriculture depends on the natural systems. That means people are left hungry with nothing to eat or nothing to drink. We are here today to demand for justice from the leaders. because we are not responsible as people from Africa, and yet most times we are not being heard. Our voices are not being heard. Our voices are left behind.
Up next, we have someone from our second one from the UK, is Michaela Loach from the Stop Campbell campaign, and she's also one of the young people taking the UK government to court on climate change. Woo!
My heart was broken by the people inside that COP building, by the world leaders who steal our sacred words and use them to defend and uphold the oppressive systems of capitalism and white supremacy, who tell us that action needed to prevent sea level rise engulfing my ancestral home in Jamaica is impossible or not practical. In this heartbreak, fear and despair, I felt weak, but I will allow myself the space for my heart to break, so that the gold of community can be poured into those cracks and make it stronger, make it bigger, because every time my heart breaks, it is made stronger. The antidote to despair is not to run away or ignore the realities of the societal violence around us. It is not to ignore the violence of our siblings on the front lines who experience at the hands of the neocolonial fossil fuel companies. It is not to ignore the hypocrisy of the UK government, the hosts of this conference, who prop up these violent fossil fuel companies with £4 billion of our public money in subsidies. This same government who are trying to approve the Cambo oil field and 39 other oil and gas projects at a time when the IEA and the IPCC have said that we can have no new investment in oil and gas if we want a livable future. This is worse than hypocrisy. It is violence. In the face of this violence and despair, we cannot give up. We cannot be overwhelmed. We must act. These are last resort times. So do whatever you can and be audacious about how incredible the future we can create can be. We have to believe that we can achieve it.
Good afternoon, Glasgow. Can I see the fist up? There you go. My name is Rakiab. I'm the spokesperson of Free West Papua campaign. And I stand here in full solidarity on behalf of the indigenous peoples of West Papua. West Papua is the western half of the island of New Guinea, world's largest tropical island, described as one of the most frontline areas with the most unique land and marine biodiversity. Once the home of the indigenous West Papuans, New Guinea Island has become a colonized land by Indonesia today, having world's largest gold mine owned by a U.S. mining corporation, BP with having their one of the largest LNG gas projects, and palm oil companies destroying our ancient lands. World's third largest lung threatened with extinction of how the people. If I reflect you, our current status, 4.6 billion years of life, to just 10 years to prevent irreversible destruction of Earth's ecosystems. What does innovation and development means? So this is where climate justice is about. And if I may reflect one of the outcomes of the UN IPCC that states that just 5% of world's populations exist of indigenous communities, have preserved more than 80% of world's remaining biodiversity. They are the most important stakeholders who've been ignored at COP26.
Hello. My name is Elena Walinga. My community is a community that has been suffering from the oil industry since before I was even born. And that is the reality of many, many indigenous and Amazonian communities in Ecuador and in the other Amazonian countries. But I want to talk about how is this even possible? How is it even possible that we have every year more concessions and how we every year can see more oil platforms being built in the Amazon? It is only possible because there are people financing that. And the same people that are perpetuating this violence on our lands are the same ones having the negotiations over there in that building at COP. We need to start talking about this. Behind every murder that happens in the Amazon, or that happens to every killing that happens to a land defender, there is a company behind that, there is a government behind that, there is a name behind that. U.S. and European banks are every day financing and investing in the Amazon destruction. They're investing in the killing of the Amazon and in the killing of the people. There are people actually responsible for this, and we need to hold them accountable.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am John Bonifacio from the Southern People's Action on COP26. I'm also part of Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines and Fridays for Future Most Affected Peoples and Areas. Right now, just a bus ride away from here, world leaders are talking about youth empowerment in addressing climate change. And for the past few days, and actually decades, youth around the world have tried to play a role in all the negotiations about our present and future. And yet we, the youth from the Global South, alongside so many more of the most impacted peoples of the world, are here. That is because we have been excluded. Peoples who have fought tooth and nail to get here to Glasgow, while billionaires and fossil fuel CEOs coming in their private jets and super yachts get to speak at COP and lecture us on how to save the planet. The Philippines is one of the most impacted countries when it comes to the climate crisis. I have witnessed firsthand how two of the costliest typhoons to ever hit the country just last year, floods reaching the roofs of 2- or 3-story buildings, lives and livelihoods erased overnight. On top of this, our President Rodrigo Duterte is cracking down on environmental activism, calling for the massacre of indigenous Lumad peoples, other land and environment defenders, and shutting down climate activists by calling us terrorists. It's no wonder that the Philippines has remained the deadliest country in Asia for 8 consecutive years. Gloria Capitan, Obilo Bayao, Datu Victor Danyan, all assassinated under the Duterte regime for protesting against destructive coal, mining, and plantation projects in the Philippines. The climate crisis is not an issue, it's an issue of today, not 2050, not 2030. And each second these world leaders delay action towards global mitigation and adaptation condemns billions across the world to an unlivable future.
That's John Bonifacio, Filipino climate justice activist, speaking along with others in Glasgow at the Fridays for Future rally this weekend. When we come back, we'll hear from Greta Thunberg, Vanessa Nakate, and more. Stay with us.
Somos los cholos, los flags de los caras de nana, los caras de nada. Somos los patis pelados, los kumas, los cholos y que más. Somos los cholos, los flags de los caras de nana, nada. Somos los cholos, los flags de los caras de nana, los caras de nada. Pa' mí que tu carta siempre fue derecha, me da la sospecha que tú te aprovechas, tú nada cosechas, ni prende la vela, ni ahí con tu escuela no te prendo vela. Anda y escucha la lucha del cafeinado, tremenda truta, ya no hay excusa para ser blanducha, no se me confunda, buena capucha, upacay, ¿cómo estás? No necesito estar high, este sistema se cae si tú no compras. Upacay, ¿cómo estás? No necesito estar high, este sistema se cae si tú no compras. Glasgow, make some noise! Latinoamérica! Palestina! Make some noise! 1, 2, 3. El amigo de todo, un amigo de nadie. Cántalo suave, lucha de clase. Cómo se hace la llave y el pase. Va que todo esto se cabe. Todo se sabe, todo se irá a caer.
Chilean artist and activist Ana Tijoux performing at Saturday's climate protest in Glasgow, Scotland. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, as we bring you Climate Countdown. I'm Amy Goodman. Yes, we are covering the Glasgow summit from the United States, from Glasgow itself, and from places around the world for those who couldn't make it to Glasgow. We turn now to 18-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg. She spoke on Friday at the rally in Glasgow organized by Fridays for the Future, an international movement of students which grew out of her climate strike outside the Swedish parliament that began in 2018.
It is not a secret that COP26 is a failure. It should be obvious that we cannot solve a crisis with the same methods that got us into it in the first place. And more people are starting to realize this. Many are starting to ask themselves, what will it take for the people in power to wake up? But let's be clear, they are already awake. They know exactly what they are doing. They know exactly what priceless values they are sacrificing to maintain business as usual. The leaders are not doing nothing. They are actively creating loopholes and shaping frameworks to benefit themselves and to continue profiting from this destructive system. This is an active choice by the leaders to continue to let the exploitation of people and nature and the destruction of present and future living conditions to take place. The COP has turned into a PR event where leaders are giving beautiful speeches and announcing fancy commitments and targets, while behind the curtains, the governments of the global north countries are still refusing to take any drastic climate action. It seems like their main goal is to continue to fight for the status quo. And COP26 has been named the most exclusionary COP ever. This is a climate conference. This is now a global greenwash festival. A 2-week-long celebration of business as usual and blah, blah, blah. The most affected people in the most affected areas still remain unheard. And the voices of future generations are drowning in their greenwash and empty words and promises. But the facts do not lie, and we know that our emperors are naked. To stay below the targets set in the Paris Agreement and thereby minimizing the risks of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control, we need immediate, drastic, annual emission cuts unlike anything the world has ever seen. And as we don't have the technological solutions that alone will do anything even close to that, that means we will have to fundamentally change our society. And this is the uncomfortable result of our leaders' repeated failure to address this crisis. At the current emissions rates, our remaining CO2 budgets to give us the best chances of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius will be gone within the end of this decade. And the climate and ecological crisis, of course, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is directly tied to other crises and injustices that date back to colonialism and beyond. Crises based on the idea that some people are worth more than others and therefore have the right to steal others, to exploit others, and to steal their land and resources. And it is very naive of us to think that we could solve this crisis without addressing the root cause of it. But this is not going to be spoken about inside the COP. It's just too uncomfortable. It's much easier for them to simply ignore the historical debt that the countries of the global north have towards the most affected people and areas. And the question we must now ask ourselves is, what is it that we are fighting for? Are we fighting to save ourselves and the living planet? Or are we fighting to maintain business as usual?
Is Greta Thunberg speaking at a Fridays for Future rally in Glasgow, where the UN Climate Summit is taking place. On Saturday, the COP26 coalition organized another major protest in Glasgow as part of the Day of Global Action. This is 24-year-old Ugandan climate activist Vanessa Nakate.
In 2019, I started a project that involves the installation of solar panels and eco-friendly stoves in schools in Uganda. And we have so far done installations in 13 schools. It has been beautiful seeing these schools finally have light and the excitement of the students and the teachers at the end of the installations. It has always been pure joy, and I'm so thankful to everyone supporting this project. However, last evening I received a message from the head teacher from one of the schools, and it read, "Good evening, Vanessa. Thanks for everything. At at Butega Primary School, the heavy storm came and destroyed the roofing of our school. We don't know what next. My heart froze, and then he started to send pictures, and I could see the roofs of the classrooms, the iron sheets destroyed, and around six children standing in front of the classroom without the roof, and the head teacher holding the once installed solar panel. Some of the crops from the school farm were also on the ground. It was so devastating to see. And then the head teacher sent me an audio, and some of the hurtful words and striking words he told me were, "We are here in an outcry, as you can see. Yesterday, we had a very strong storm because of the rain. It came when it was so heavy. It has destroyed everything. It has destroyed our crops, the school roof, and our solar, which you provided, was also put down. We are trying to fix it, but things are not easy. We were so worried about the panel, but I think it was not destroyed. We shall test it and see if it is still working, but all the wires and the bulbs were destroyed. I need someone to tell me how to explain to the head teacher that the strong winds and the heavy rainfall will not stop because the words and promises of leaders do not match their actions. And this is just one example, just one. Many schools are being destroyed because of extreme weather events. I need someone to tell me how to explain to farmers who are losing their crops and farms because of droughts and floods that seem to never end. And leaders continue to open up new coal power plants, construct oil pipelines, and frack gas without paying attention and listening to the voices crying out for help because of the destruction that is happening. That leaders have failed to understand that we cannot eat coal, we cannot drink oil, and we cannot breathe so-called natural gas. Is there anyone among you who can help me explain to girls dropping out of schools, girls being forced into early marriages, women walking long distances to collect water and find food for their families, that the decisions being made by governments right now are only going to increase the challenges that they are facing?
Ugandan climate activist Vanessa Nakate speaking at the climate rally in Glasgow Saturday. Other speakers included Kathy Jetno-Kijiner, the poet and climate activist from the Marshall Islands.
Yahweh Gomaleb, Yahweh! Hello, everybody. I traveled all the way out from my home, the Marshall Islands, so that I can be here with you all today to join the call for climate justice and climate action. And I'm grateful and humbled to be given this platform to speak. The Marshall Islands is located in the northern Pacific Ocean. We are an atoll nation, only 2 meters above sea level, with no mountains like some of the bigger islands, no mountains or higher ground to go to. Some people here will tell you that our very existence is at stake, and up to this COP, I would have said the same thing. With the rising sea level, even half a meter of sea level rise will result in water flooding our islands, and our islands will become unlivable in 20 years. We would just need 2-story walls around our entire islands just to keep the water out. So the physical existence of our islands is what's at stake. That's why I flew all the way here over multiple planes for over 18 hours. That's why I flew for the first time in 2 years since the pandemic began. I haven't left my islands for 2 years since our borders closed during the start of COVID, but I knew the only reason I'd leave is to make sure our message gets here. Thank you. Jesus. Okay. And my message is this. We as a people are not going anywhere. We survived 3 eras of colonialism. We survived over 60 nuclear weapons detonated in our islands during the U.S. nuclear weapons testing program. And let me tell you, we will survive climate change. We refuse to leave. We refuse to go anywhere. And our sovereignty is not up for debate. But we do need collective action. We need the biggest emitters to be held accountable. We need financing to implement the solutions we're developing ourselves. We contribute 0.00005% of the world's global emissions. We did nothing to contribute to this crisis, and we should not have to pay the consequences.
Kathy Jetnil-Kijiner, the poet and climate activist from the Marshall Islands, speaking at a climate rally in Glasgow Saturday. Visit democracynow.org to see our past interviews with Kathy, as well as her reading, her poetry, and also the interview with Kathy and her mother, the former president of the Marshall Islands, as well as our interviews with Vanessa Nakate and Greta Thunberg at past UN climate summits. When we come back, 1,000 land and environmental defenders have been killed since the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015. Stay with us.
Ooh, ah, ooh, ah. I took a trip to the beach and the water was cold. The ocean called out to me. I did what I was told. Diving under and over, tried to hide from the waves, but they always found me. A smell, a sight, a touch, a sound drags me like a riptide. Back in time, I think I'm bound to memories I can't fight. Then I remember I am the ocean. All these waves come out of me, and I hold them. All these drops of memories, I am vast and unexplored, full of life and so much more. I am the ocean.
Ocean by Ulya here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, as we bring you Climate Countdown. I'm Amy Goodman. We go now to Glasgow, where activists held a memorial for those who are unable to attend the UN Climate Summit this year. The 1,005 land and environmental defenders who've been murdered since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. 1 in 3 of those killed was an Indigenous person. At the Fridays for Future mass rally in Glasgow, climate activists from Colombia talked about the murders of land defenders in their country.
We are climate activists from Colombia, and today we want to honor the socio-environmental defenders that have been killed in the last 2 years of no COP. Colombia is the most dangerous country to be an environmental defender in the whole world, and no one cares.
In our country, we say those who died defending life cannot be considered dead. We would like to invite you to join us in saying some of their names. We cannot say all of their names because it would become night if we said all of their names. We will each name one environmental defender that was assassinated in our country and their story. After, we will say justice for this leader, and we would like you to answer back in unison, justice, while raising your fist. Let's try it now. Maritza Isabel Quiroz was a land defender and peasant leader. She was assassinated in Santa Marta in 2019. Justice for Maritza.
Justice!
Juana Perea, she was an environmental leader and women's organizer opposed to the Puerto of Truga, and she was assassinated in Nuquí in 2020. Justice for Juana.
Justice!
Magdalena Cucunawa, she was an indigenous people's defender from the Macaguan community, and she was assassinated in Arauca in 2019. Justice for Magdalena.
Justice! Yamit Alonso Silva Torres. He was defender of the Cocuy National Park, and he was assassinated in Boyacá last year. Justice for Yamit. Justice!
And many more, but time won't be enough to name all of them. That's why we need the Escazú Agreement to be ratified, because it's the link between climate justice and human rights, and it's the only mechanism to protect them. Because we won't achieve any solution here at COP26 if we don't defend the defenders.
This comes as 2020 was the deadliest year on record for environmental defenders. For more, we go inside the COP, inside COP26, the Conference of Parties, the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow, Scotland. We're joined by two guests. Louis Wilson is a senior advisor at Global Witness, who helped write their report, Last Line of Defense, the Industries Causing the Climate Crisis and Attacks Against Land and Environmental Defenders. Also with us, Andrea Ishu. She's a Maya Quiche leader, journalist, and human rights defender based in Guatemala. She's in Glasgow for the COP26 with the collective Futuros Indígenas. That's Indigenous Futures. We welcome you back, Andrea, to Democracy Now! And want to begin with you. Talk about those who couldn't make it, not because of COVID, not because of the pandemic, but because they were murdered. Over 1,000 land defenders, water protectors, environmentalists since the climate accord was signed in Paris in 2015.
Thank you, Amy. I would like to start honoring the existence, the lives of these people that are taking care of forests, land, water, air, that are facing the effects of the climate crisis, but also facing the violence that in countries like Guatemala is imposed by Guatemalan government, by the extractive industry that is not just causing the climate crisis, but also perpetuating colonialist behavior in our territories and in our lands. I am here also to say that there has been a lot of indigenous people that has been put into prison, that it's not allowed to be in their communities defending their land and their territory because of demilitarization. As we speak, in the Maya Quechí region of Guatemala, the community of El Estor is under a state of siege. We are worried about the life of Cristobal Pop and a lot of other indigenous leaders that are right now living in open resistance against a big extractive nickel mine that it's being imposed in their communities, and Guatemalan government is protecting the interest of the Solway company in Guatemala to extract the nickel, and at this moment the military people is going to the people's houses, it's on the street militarizing their territories and their lands.
So let's stay in this community that you've just addressed, El Estor in Guatemala. The president of Guatemala, Giammattei, imposing a curfew that would prevent the kind of public gatherings, the protests that are taking place there. Can you talk about the fact that Giammattei actually came to the COP and what message you have for him, but also if you could talk further about how that's enabled by countries like the United States?
It's really sad to say that the government, the president of your country is more worried about protecting foreign investments than the wellness, than the good living, than the dignified life for indigenous communities and the people in Guatemala. So what we have discovered also that is related with this company and President Giammattei is that he is receiving money from these companies, that there are corrupt acts that have been shown, and that's also related with the long period of corruption scandals that had put different presidents of Guatemala under the protest of a lot of thousands of people. So there is a necessity to call to President Giammattei to assume his responsibility with its own people, not with foreign investors. We're calling also him for his resignation because he looks more like the CEO for these transnational companies than actually the president of Guatemala. We are demanding freedom from the journalists, communitarian journalists that are part of independent media in Guatemala that had been put into threats because they were documenting the militarization and the violence. And also that it's really important to say around all these mega projects, it's that they are trying to say that they bring development to communities and that they're trying to say that they are bringing good lifestyles to communities. But what we have been seeing and documenting in what it has been happening in El Estor since 1960s is pollution, is destruction of social fabric, of biodiversity, and also a lot of violence against the Maya Quechí people in El Estor y Zabal.
Your group in Futuros Indígenas, Indigenous Futures, Talk about how the collective is navigating their way through this bureaucracy at COP26. We heard, for example, Greta Thunberg talking about this as a failure, this COP. And we're going to be talking about the number of representatives of fossil fuel companies outnumbering any one single delegation from a country.
Yes, it's really sad that this COP was told that it's going to be the most inclusive COPs of all. But what we have faced traveling from Central America, from Mexico to Glasgow was really different. It seems like there was institutionalized bureaucracy for exclusion of indigenous peoples, of indigenous communities, of observers. So we're calling into the attention of the UNFCCC mechanism so they can open up this for more participation of indigenous communities. We need that the indigenous leaders, that the indigenous communities are actually seated making decisions. We just do not want to be observers. And also, something that had happened to us is that when we are trying to go inside of the negotiations as observers, we're seated outside of the rooms, asked to watch the negotiations on a screen. So what made us travel all along Central America to Glasgow if we're going just to be seated outside of the rooms to watch a screen? That's something that you can do from your country. So that's not inclusion at all. That's violence. And that's why we're calling into the attention to say that. We decided to come to the COP because it's really important that nothing is here happening in the name of the peoples without the presence and the participation of indigenous peoples. So that's really important. And we're also here to say that we're living solutions to the climate crisis. If you want to check on solutions on climate crisis, you need to check on what the indigenous communities have been doing for thousands of years. We have the 80% of the remaining biodiversity of the world. That means something. That means that there are ways of living and existing. Indigenous communities have ways of existing in the planet without destroying it. And what is sad, what is going on inside of the COP, is that some that are called the nature-based solutions to climate change are more colonialism in indigenous lands. So we're also calling to the attention of the leaders of the companies that are trying to sell new solutions to climate crisis, but that are actually going to be implemented with violence, without consultation in indigenous communities and indigenous lands. Something that is really important to say is that the alternatives are there in communities, indigenous communities, but also if you want to create more solutions to the climate crisis, it's really important to give land back to indigenous communities.
I want to turn to some of the people we're talking about who've been murdered. This is Berta Cáceres. She was speaking in 2015 after being awarded the prestigious Goldman Environmental Prize for her work protecting indigenous communities for her environmental justice campaign against the massive dam on the sacred Guacarque River in Honduras. She was assassinated inside her home in La Esperanza, Honduras, about a year later.
En nuestras cosmovisiones,
in our worldviews, we are beings who come from the earth, from the water, and from corn. The Lenca people are ancestral guardians of the rivers, in turn protected by the spirits of young girls, who teach us that giving our lives in various ways for the protection of the rivers is giving our lives for the well-being of humanity and of this planet.
In 2019, we spoke to one of Berta Cáceres' daughters, Laura Zuniga Cáceres, while Democracy Now! Was at the Madrid COP25 UN summit. Laura was there to receive a Human Rights Award and to speak at the Social Summit for the Climate, an alternative climate summit hosted by the activists. I asked her about the risks indigenous women face in Honduras as they fight to protect the earth.
Yo creo que son varios. Una de las cosas es que así como se viola y se destruye.
Just like the land in our territory is violated and destroyed, so are our bodies. And that is something that is a constant in countries like Honduras. We know that we are at risk. We know that they kill us, that they rape us, that they attack our families.
Pero yo también creo que somos las mujeres.
But I also believe that it is women who are carrying out resistance, leadership. My mom's leadership is just one story, but when we go to other communities, we find great women leaders, and that also has to do with generating alliances that allow us to strengthen ourselves.
So that's Laura Zuniga Cáceres talking about the indigenous work that is being done in Honduras, like that done by her assassinated mother, Berta. We're going to turn now to 2020. To another continent. We're going to turn to South Africa. Fikile Ntshangase was a leading force in the fight against the Tendele coal mine before she was murdered in October. 3 unknown assailants entered her home and assassinated her. This is Malungelo Shakaza, Fikile's daughter, speaking to Global Witness earlier this year.
My mom would receive anonymous calls like from unknown numbers, and people would tell her that her day is coming. My mom was murdered on the 22nd of October in 2020. If I was home, I would have tried to do something, and then my son would have lost both my mother and I on that very same day. Before the mine talks were surrounding the community, we were a united community. We were happy. We were free to walk wherever you wanted to walk. You could be friends with anyone that you wanted to be friends with. We are afraid to even ask questions at a meeting about electricity, at a meeting about water, at a meeting about schools, because you don't know what might cause you to be a target.
I want to bring into this conversation Louis Wilson, the senior advisor at Global Witness, who helped organize the memorial outside COP26 in Glasgow with others to commemorate the murdered land defenders and help write their report, Last Line of Defense, the industries causing the climate crisis and attacks against land and environmental defenders. Louis Wilson, if you can talk about South Africa.
Absolutely. The case you've just described was just one of 227 murders of climate and land activists last year, but it was one that really stuck in the mind. Fikile Ntshangase was, by all accounts, an amazing leader, but also a grandmother, and she was murdered in her home as her grandson played outside. The assailants murdered her in cold blood, having asked her grandson, Buyile, if his grandmother was in. And he answered yes, she was. The case is also remarkable because there is no real ongoing investigation into Fikile's murder. There have been no arrests, and the community there has been terrorized by the events. What's really remarkable, though, is that Malungelo, who we just heard from, having had no previous interest in environmental activism, after what happened, has taken up the campaign. And I think that bravery, that courage in the face of that violence can give us hope for our fight in the climate crisis.
And so, you know, we were just talking with Andrea Ishu about the nickel mine in El Astor, and then you have this coal mine in South Africa. Overall, talk about the threat to environmental defenders, and then go to the environmentalist in Mexico who was recently murdered.
Absolutely. So the stories that we hear are in each instance a tragedy, but as you look at the global picture, you see a common thread, that the threats against environmental activists are caused by the same forces that are driving the climate crisis. So the same force that is pulling minerals out of the ground, that is felling trees, that is polluting our air, is also causing violence and threats against activists. So the case you've just referenced in Mexico was just a month prior to Fikile's death. An activist called Oscar A. Raud in Tecate in northern Mexico had been protesting for years water access. His community, an indigenous community there, had been denied access to traditional water resources at the same time as a big corporation, Heineken, was granted additional access by the local government. Oscar was murdered on September 22nd, and nobody, I think, would suggest that Heineken directly organised that killing, but it's clear that they created the conditions that made that murder possible. And it's very difficult to see that murder, or indeed many of the other 227 murders, taking place without that resource extraction by big companies.
And the violence getting worse. Can you talk about who's funding these industries? In Mexico, you have documented 30 lethal attacks against land defenders in 2020, 67% increase from 2019. Colombia, number 1, second, Mexico, deadliest countries for environmental defenders.
Absolutely. Across the globe, violence is increasing, and really we can understand the killing of land and environmental activists as another metric of the climate crisis. As we see these other indicators spiral out of control, you're also seeing violence get worse. And what that tells us is that the climate crisis is also a human rights issue. I think at COP we've heard a lot of talk about scientific fixes, about accounting tricks that we can do to round off this climate crisis. And actually, this is a political issue. And without severe and drastic redistribution of political power and putting human rights at the centre of our response to the climate crisis, the violence will continue, and sadly, so too will the other metrics continue to spiral out of control.
Louis Wilson, you're a senior advisor with Global Witness, which just put out an analysis of the hundreds of fossil fuel lobbyists flooding COP26 climate talks. You found, quote, if the fossil fuel lobby were a country delegation at COP, it would be the largest, with 503 delegates, 24 more than the largest country delegation. Your colleague, I want to go to this clip, Dominique Kavakeb with Global Witness, made this video as he documented the greenwashing events at COP26 that promote fossil fuels under the guise of renewable energy.
I'm here at COP26 and I'm standing outside the European Union's pavilion area. It's their official area where they host all of their side events. And this week they've got a number of events under the banner Energy Transition, which sounds fantastic until you realise that they have handed the mic over to a whole bunch of fossil fuel companies and their lobbyists to organise some of these events. This includes an event on hydrogen hosted by the lobby group Hydrogen Europe, whose members include the likes of Shell, Total and Equinor. And they've been pushing the European Commission to allow hydrogen produced using dirty fossil electricity the label of renewable. We've also got a whole load of other events run by gas companies the likes of GRT Gaz in France, Italy's Snam, all with the aim of promoting their work and promoting the gas industry.
So, Louis Wilson, can you lay out the findings from the Global Witness analysis of fossil fuel lobbyists flooding the COP26 climate talks that your colleague is describing?
Absolutely. We released data today showing that, as you note, the largest delegation at COP26, billed as the last best chance to avert climate disaster, the largest delegation here is the fossil fuel lobby. And we analysed publicly available data from the UNFCCC, and we found that 503 delegates are here representing either fossil fuel companies, over 100 fossil fuel companies are represented here, or trade associations who are lobbying for fossil fuels. And that delegation is actually larger than the combined delegations of the 8 worst affected countries by the climate crisis, including countries like the Philippines. We don't allow tobacco lobbyists into health conferences, so it begs the question why fossil fuel lobbyists are being allowed into the most important climate conference in a generation.
So we only have 15 seconds, but Andrea, I want to give you the last word. What then gives you hope?
I think that the future is a territory that we must defend. I said that the living alternatives, that the living solutions to the climate crisis already exist in indigenous communities that needs to be respected. I am also calling to the responsibility of the people around the world to stop consuming and exterminating indigenous territories and indigenous lands. We need to create solutions that are respectful with the life, with the planet, with ourselves, to think about a future where we do not need fossil fuels, but other green and renewable energies
leave it there, Andrea,
that are
Andrea
colonialism
Issue and Louis Wilson, thank you so much.